The bell rang 3 times before anyone died. That was the part the Kethvarun never accounted for. They had studied humanity for 6 decades from their observation posts in the deep ocean trenches, mapped every organized crime syndicate, every street gang, every cartel and Yakuza family in the Northern Hemisphere, cataloged the human tendency for hierarchical violence, and used it as a blueprint. They understood that human power structures ate themselves, that the strongest predator in a territory never looked up. So the Kethvarun had come down wearing those structures like a second skin. By the time anyone understood what the string of assassinations really meant, half of Earth's most battle-hardened covert operatives were already dead. They hadn't counted on the bell. And they certainly hadn't counted on K.L. Momota. He was driving a second-hand delivery van when it started. The van had a cracked side mirror, a broken heat gauge, and a bobblehead of a cartoon bear on the dashboard that K.L. had found in the vehicle when he took the job and never removed, because it amused him. He was not an impressive-looking man, 26 years old, bone-thin, with the unfortunate hair of someone who cut it himself and the faded work overalls of a courier who moved packages for a logistics firm in Sapporo. He had never once mentioned to his employer, a severe woman named Hayashi-san, who communicated, mostly in disappointed silences, that he had once spent 4 years at a classified special operations training facility in Nagano that didn't officially exist. He had never mentioned that he had been the youngest human being ever to complete the facility's full curriculum. He had never mentioned what he had done in the 3 years between leaving the facility and taking the delivery job. He was thinking about none of this. He was thinking about the most efficient route to avoid the construction on Odori Avenue and quietly humming something his mother had sung when he was small, an old folk tune about a fisherman who walked out every morning into the cold as though the sea owed him nothing. His phone buzzed. The notification was not from his employer. It wasn't from anyone listed in his contacts. It was from a number that had no digits at all. Just a small icon he had not seen in 3 years, the outline of a bell, rendered in gray pixels no larger than a grain of rice. K.L. pulled the van to the curb and sat very still for several seconds. Around him, the morning traffic continued. A woman walked past with a shopping bag. A pigeon investigated a puddle. The world was indifferent and ordinary. He reached into the glove compartment, beneath the registration papers and an emergency rain poncho, and withdrew a slim rectangular case no bigger than a deck of cards. Inside, on a bed of worn foam, lay a small bronze bell threaded on a cord of braided silk. The silk had frayed at one end. The bell itself was tarnished except at the striker, which was bright with use. He had not touched it in 3 years. It rang again, faintly, as though it were remembering how. K.L. Momota closed his eyes for a moment, breathed out, and said very quietly to the cartoon bobblehead bear, "All right." He learned the shape of the problem in stages, the way you learn the shape of a room in darkness, by running into the walls. First wall was the conference in Kyoto. 11 people had died in that room, and not a single security camera in the building had recorded any intruder. The bodies had been found by a cleaning staff member at 6 in the morning. The method of death was not gunfire, not poison, not conventional blade work. The forensic reports which K.L. obtained through channels he still had, and that his employer definitely did not know about, described internal catastrophic failures with no external wound markers, as if something had reached through the men and stopped them at the molecular level. The second wall was the survivor. A single man had walked out of that conference room under his own power. A hulking figure who witnesses described as having eyes like amber glass that caught the light wrong, throwing back a gleam that didn't match the angle of the lamps. His name in the documents was Garan, that was all. One name. Surname, no organizational affiliation, no address, no country of origin. He had registered his interest in the consolidation of the northern distribution networks. He had smiled at everyone in the room. Nobody who saw that smile described it the same way twice. Some said it was warm. Some said it was like watching a predator decide you weren't worth the effort. One surviving security guard, interviewed in a hospital bed where he was being treated for a minor cardiac event that the doctors could not explain, said the smile had made him think of something he'd seen once in a nature documentary. A deep-sea creature filmed from a submersible. Something vast and bioluminescent, turning its face toward the camera light with an expression of absolute patience. Third wall was Mira Nindo. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a shipping executive named Tadashi Nindo, who ran legitimate business in the day and considerably less legitimate business at night. Nindo Sr. had been found dead in his Sapporo home 3 days ago. Mira did not know yet why it mattered that she was still alive. She did not know yet that Garan had looked at her photograph and made a decision that the Kethvaru-Un Strategic Council had apparently ratified within the hour. She did not know that the bronze bell in Kale's glove compartment had been given to her father's father by a man whose name was not recorded anywhere, at a time when the first anomalous disappearances of senior figures were beginning and someone with very old information had understood what they meant. What she did know was that the boy who had delivered packages to her father's office for 2 years was standing at her front door at 7 in the morning, looking different than she had ever seen him look. Same face, same bad hair, same cheap work clothes. But something behind his eyes had rearranged itself. Something had come to attention. "You should pack a bag," Kale said. "Not a big one. My father is dead, I know. 3 men died outside the Hakodate harbor last night. 2 more at the Nindo distribution center in Otaru. Someone is." She stopped. The word she had reached for was wrong. Something is systematically removing every node of the organization. Yes. "Why are you here?" Kale reached into his pocket and held out the bronze bell. In the early morning light, it was nothing impressive. A dull piece of old metalwork on a fraying cord. Mira Nindo went very still when she saw it. The same way she had gone still in a dream she'd had twice in the past week. A dream about stone stairs descending into cold light, and a figure in white who had placed this exact object in her hands and said, "When the darkness wears a face, ring it." She had dismissed the dream as grief. "Pack a bag," Kale said again, and this time she went inside and did it. They used the van. This was deliberate. The van was dull and invisible. It smelled of cardboard. It was registered to a company that had never done anything interesting. Kale drove south out of the city along the coastal road, where the sea came in flat and gray and enormous on the right side. He did not explain things in a rush. He explained them the way his instructor at the facility had explained things, which was to say he established what was true, named what was unknown, and declined to speculate beyond that boundary. What was true? 12 senior figures in 4 separate criminal networks in the Hokkaido Tohoku region had been killed in 30 days. The method was consistent. The motive, on the surface, appeared to be territorial consolidation. One entity accumulating control, removing competing power structures. This was a pattern human crime organizations had executed many times in history. What was also true, the entity executing this consolidation was not human. He said this without drama, watching the road. Mira sat in the passenger seat with the bag on her lap and did not ask him to repeat it or argue with it. "How long have you known?" she said. "I suspected when I read the forensic reports. I confirmed it yesterday through contacts I have. There is no entry wound in any of the bodies. What the pathologists are calling internal failures is something else. The cellular structure around the injury sites shows a geometry that doesn't occur in any human trauma pattern. Similar signatures were recorded twice before. Once in Buenos Aires in 2011, once in Vladivostok in 2018. Both were attributed to unidentified pathogens and quietly filed away. Mira looked out at the sea. Fishing boat sat far out on the water, motionless. "And the bell," she said. "The bell has been in my family for 6 generations. My ancestral line was sworn to protect your ancestral line. I know this sounds. I know how this sounds. But the person who gave your grandfather that bell was not operating on superstition. They were operating on intelligence. Your family line carries something that makes Mira Nindo strategically valuable to whatever Garan represents. The bell activates when that value is recognized by the threat. So I'm bait. You're the reason. The consolidation isn't an end in itself. It's infrastructure. Garan is building something, and you are the keystone he needs to complete it." Kale paused. "He wants to marry you." That's the direct translation of what his associates communicated to what's left of the Nindo organization's senior staff. dressed it in the language of alliance and bloodline legacy. But the underlying meaning is biological. He wants to produce offspring that carry both lineages. Mira was quiet for a long time. He killed my father, she finally said. Yes. Then we have different ideas about how this ends. Something small and private happened at the corner of Kale's mouth. Quite a smile, more like recognition. Yes, he said. We do. They met the others at a rest stop south of Tomakomai, a brutal concrete building with fluorescent lights that buzzed, and a vending machine that had been out of everything except one brand of canned coffee for what appeared to be several years. 2 people were waiting inside. Kale had contacted them the same way he'd been contacted himself. A notification from a number with no digits. They had both responded within minutes. The first was a woman named June Arakawa. She was small and enormously strong, and she moved with the relaxed efficiency of someone who had spent years deciding exactly how much force every situation required. She had been a competitive wrestler before she was recruited to the facility, and she had never entirely stopped being one. She looked at Mira with frank assessment, the ways a mechanic looks at a vehicle they're being asked to guarantee. She'll slow us down, June said. She's the reason there's a us at all, Kale said. Then she better be worth it. Mira set her bag on a plastic chair, unzipped it, and removed a compact first aid kit, a folded topographic map of the Hokkaido coastline, and a tactical flashlight with a cracked bezel. She spread these on the table with practiced efficiency. I grew up the Nindo organization, she said without looking up. I know every secondary facility, every safe house, every maintenance route, and back approach to every property my father owned. I know which of the surviving senior staff can still be trusted and which have already been turned. I also have the access codes to the Nindo communication infrastructure, which means I can hear everything Garan is telling his people and send them information he would rather they didn't have. She looked up. Does that address the concern? Jun stared at her. Then she picked up one of the canned coffees from the vending machine slot, opened it, and sat down. All right, she said. The second person was Hiro Suzuka. He was tall and quiet, and had the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that being underestimated was a resource. He had served 2 years with a joint operations unit that had been officially disbanded in 2019 and unofficiously continued for another year under a different budget line. His role had been surveillance and infiltration. His specialty was becoming unremarkable, entering a space, moving through it, leaving no memory of his passage. He could have been the man behind the counter, the maintenance worker, the delivery driver. He could have been anyone. He looked at Kale when Kale walked in and said, "The anomalous signature. I've been tracking reports. There are 6 more sites in the past 10 days. They're moving faster. How many of Garan's people can we identify by location? 3 with confidence, 1 probable, 2 I lost last night. They dropped off every system simultaneously, which means they moved to a communication protocol we haven't mapped yet." Kale spread his own map on the table next to Mira's. Then we work from the information we have and we move before they complete the consolidation. Once Garan controls the full network, he has everything he needs except her. 3 people looked at a map in a concrete building in the middle of nowhere. Hostel's wind pushed gray clouds across a gray sky. The vending machine buzzed. Someone had left a wrapper on the floor, and it shifted in the draft from the door, scraping softly back and forth against the tile. It was, Kale thought, not how he had imagined this going when he was 12 years old, and his grandmother had first shown him the facility records. He had imagined something more dramatic, a mountain, a ceremony, swords. He was wearing work overalls and his knee hurt from a bad landing he'd made 3 years ago and had never entirely recovered from. He drank the terrible canned coffee and looked at the map and thought about the fishermen who walked into the cold sea every morning, as though it owed him nothing. The next 4 days were infrastructure and patience. They moved through the Nindo network's secondary sites in a specific order, guided by Mira's knowledge of which spaces Garan's people had not yet reached and which were already compromised. Yoon drove. Kale and Hiro handled the approaches. Mira was never exposed in open space for longer than 90 seconds at a time. This was a hard rule, non-negotiable, established in the first hour, and adhered to with the grim consistency of people who understood why rules existed. At the second site, a warehouse near Mororan Harbor, they found 4 Nindo loyalists who had gone to ground and were waiting for information. Mira talked to them for 20 minutes while the others maintained a perimeter. Kale listened from 2 rooms away. He had expected her to sound frightened or grieving or both. She sounded so converting grief into fuel, a controlled burn, focused. She told the 4 men what was happening in terms they could understand, and asked each one specifically what they were willing to do. 3 agreed to join. The 4th was politely told to take a vehicle and go somewhere quiet for a month. At the 4th site, in a storage facility outside Chateau's, Hero found something that changed their model. It was a communications array, not human tech, or not entirely. The external casing was a modified piece of civilian industrial equipment, the kind that could be found in any commercial building without attracting attention. But the internal architecture was something else, a dense crystalline lattice that generated its own signal, independent of any broadcast or relay infrastructure. It was, Hero explained in a voice that stayed very level, a relay for communication between Garon's local team and something that was not local. How far not local? Jun said. Hero pointed upward. They looked at the ceiling, then threw it at implication. How many of these are there? Kale asked. I don't know. I'd need a broader survey. If this is the pattern. Hero pulled up the map. The anomalous signature sites laid over it. Each site has probably been seeded. They're not just consolidating territory. They're establishing a communications infrastructure for what comes after. After Garon had what he needed. After the keystone was in place. Kale looked at the bell on its cord around his neck, where he'd been wearing it since the first morning. It was warm from body heat. It did not ring, but it sat against his chest with a faint persistent pressure that hadn't been there 3 years ago when it was locked in a box. Destroy them, he said, all of them, in parallel. It has to be simultaneous or the intact nodes will relay an alert before we can reach them. We don't have enough people, Jun said. We have 11 people in the Mororan group, the 4 here, and the 3 in the Otaru cell Mira identified, plus us. That's 18. Against 6 confirmed sites and an unknown number of Garon's operatives. Yes. Jun put her hands flat on the table and looked at the map for a long time. All right, she said, which was how Jun Arakawa expressed agreement, enthusiasm, and occasionally emotion. Then she cracked her knuckles, one hand at a time, a sound like small decisive punctuation marks. We need a coordination window, Hero said. The sites have to go simultaneously, so we need a signal everyone can respond to at the same time, something that can't be jammed or intercepted. KL reached up and unhooked the bell from around his neck. He set it on the table. It was a small, battered, antique piece of bronze on a fraying cord, and it sat in the fluorescent light of the storage facility, making no particular claim. This rang across 300 kilometers when it started, he said. On no network, on no power. I have no empirical explanation for that. I don't need one. He looked at the people around the table. June with her wrestler's hands, Hero with his still face, Mira with her father's eyes and something harder behind them. 18 people, coordinating against an alien intelligence that has been planning this for years. We have one advantage they cannot account for, because they've never had to account for it. They've been watching human hierarchies for 60 years. They understand how human command structures function. They understand that power flows from the top down, and that destroying the top destroys the structure. He paused. We don't have a top. We have 18 people who each understand the full picture and can execute independently. Chair. The bell rings and everyone moves simultaneously without waiting for a signal that can be intercepted because the signal isn't data. They cannot jam a 70-year-old bronze bell, June. They've never had to. June picked up the bell, looked at it, set it back down. That's insane, she said. Yes. But it's the right kind of insane. Garon held court in a converted traditional inn outside Noboribetsu. He had chosen the location with the sensibility of a creature that appreciated aesthetics. In the same technical way, it appreciated everything about humanity, as data, about what the dominant species found beautiful. Worth noting because it could be mimicked. The inn was old, well-maintained, surrounded by hot spring pools that steamed in the cold air. His people moved through it with the smooth efficiency of a system operating at peak function. At night, the pools glowed with the mineral-lit blue that the local geology produced, and Garan would sometimes stand at the edge and look into the water and see if he tilted his focus slightly away from the human perception, register his biological housing required, his actual reflection. Something long and vast and patient. He was patient. He had been patient for a very long time. The work was almost complete. The relay infrastructure was nearly fully seeded. The consolidation of the criminal networks had been mechanical. Humans destroyed their own power structures reliably if given sufficient incentive. And Garan had provided that incentive with surgical precision, never revealing the hand behind the removals. The Nindo girl remained unacquired, but this was a minor delay, not a complication. She had nowhere to go that the network couldn't reach. The bell signal had been detected. An anomalous acoustic resonance that didn't match any human technology, logged by the relay system as an unknown variable. It had been flagged, it had not been identified. That was the error, not the failure to identify it. The error was in categorizing it as a variable at all. On the third morning at the inn, Garan was in the main reception hall reviewing the final consolidation reports when the first relay went offline. He noticed it the way you notice a light bulb dying. A small absence in the peripheral field. He looked up. The second relay went offline 4 seconds later. Then the third, and the fourth, and fifth, almost simultaneously. And then the sixth. And then there was nothing receiving from any of the seeded sites. And the quiet in the communication stream was absolute. He remained very still. His two primary associates. The woman called the killer, who fought with an alien physicality that no human opponent had yet survived. And the giant whose hands could breach a human thorax with the clinical ease of something that had never needed to fear the thing it was damaging. Both looked at him. They hit the relays, the killer said. Garan said nothing for a moment. He was running models. This was not a scenario he had prepared for, because he had not classified it as a possible scenario. 18 humans coordinating a simultaneous strike on 6 dispersed locations required command infrastructure. His models assigned a low probability to any human group generating that infrastructure quickly enough, from a cold start, to act before the consolidation was complete. He had not modeled a bell. Bring the girl here, he said now. Use every asset. She's not at any of the covered locations. Then find her. What he didn't know, what he could not know, because it wasn't in any of the surveillance data, wasn't in the 60 years of human observation, wasn't in any model derived from studying how hierarchies function, was that Mira Nindo had been in the inn's parking area for 11 minutes. She had come in a maintenance vehicle driven by a man who had been servicing the inn's hot spring systems for 7 years, and who was one of the 3 people Mira had identified from the Otaru cell. She had walked through the service entrance with a toolbox and a high-visibility vest, and the completely ordinary face of someone who belonged here. And the 2 people Garan had positioned at the service entrance had looked at her and seen nothing worth looking at again. The bell was in her pocket. It was not ringing. She had told it not to. In the private interior language of someone who had grown up understanding that the bell's intelligence, if that word applied, responded to intent as much as crisis. She needed 2 minutes, maybe less. She found the main hall by sound. Garan's voice carried the particular resonant quality of something that had learned human vocal production as a secondary system. Technically correct. Slightly too even. Like a very good translation of music into a different instrument. She paused outside the screen door. 3 targets. Garan at the center table. The killer near the far wall. The giant by the corridor entrance. She thought of her father. Not the powerful man. Not the figure in a suit who had run a dangerous organization with cold competence. She thought of the man who had given her the bell on her 16th birthday and told her it had come to him from his father, and to his father from a stranger who appeared once and then was gone, and said, "There are things that love this world, and things that want to own it, and sometimes you will be the difference between them." She had thought it was a metaphor. He had not been speaking metaphorically. She stepped through the door. Garan looked up. Fraction of a second. The human fraction, the one she could read. His face did something that had no name in his taxonomy. Ignition arrived and collided with a model failure, and the collision expressed itself as something close to wonder. He had been looking for her for weeks. She had walked in. "You're Mira Nindo," he said. "You killed my father," she said. She had been in a delivery van 7 days ago. She had been a logistics problem, and she had spent 7 days becoming, with the unfrightening, quiet efficiency of someone doing work that needed doing, the edge of the blade. She rang the bell. What happened next was not clean. Clean was for stories that didn't include the smell of hot spring sulfur, mixing with burned circuitry, and the specific sound of Jun Arakawa hitting something very large, very hard. It was not a battle, so much as a convergence. Multiple things happening at once that had been designed to be overwhelming from any one angle, but that collapsed under the weight of being hit from all directions simultaneously. Kale came through the north entrance, 40 seconds after the bell rang. Kuro was 30 seconds ahead of him, already inside, having spent the previous 40 minutes sitting in the third floor supply closet waiting. The Nindo loyalists came in from the east and west sides of the property. The maintenance man locked the service entrance from the inside and systematically disabled the vehicles in the lot. The killer hit Kale 3 times in the first minute, and twice the contact was wrong enough that something structural in his left side informed him it would be discussing this later. She was faster than any human fighter he had trained against. She was faster than anything he had trained for. She fought with a geometry that was subtly off from human combat, as though the joints didn't quite follow the expected range, and the first 30 seconds he spent mostly surviving, while his nervous system revised its threat model in real time. The second 30 seconds he spent fighting the model he'd built, not the pattern he expected. His instructor at the facility, a wiry man with a bad knee and a worse personality who had pushed Kale through 4 years of training, with the focused unkindness of someone who cared very much whether you lived, had said something once that Kale thought about sometimes. He had said, "The only advantage you will ever have against a superior opponent is that you can surprise them. Not with a technique, with a decision. They can model your techniques. They cannot model what you decide." The killer had 6 decades of human combat data. She had every recorded technique, every documented pattern, every known response to every known situation. What she did not have was a record of Kyle Momoda deciding, in the 4th second of the 3rd exchange, to stop fighting the way he'd been trained and drop to the floor and let her overextend. Because his knee was already shot, and the floor was the only logical place to go, and do the thing she didn't have data for, because it wasn't a technique. It was just a man with a broken knee deciding that down was better than dead. She went over him. He came up behind her. The bell was still ringing somewhere in the building. It took 11 more minutes. The giant fell to June, which had a certain inevitability to it. June had spent 20 years of her life working out what to do with an opponent who was larger and stronger, and she had solved that problem more thoroughly than anyone Kale had ever watched. The Nindo loyalists handled the perimeter. Hero disabled the remaining communication hardware with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly why it mattered. Garan did not fight. This was the detail that Kale would think about later, turning it over the way you turn over a thing that doesn't resolve. When Mira rang the bell and the Nindo people came through every entrance simultaneously, Garan stood in the reception hall and looked at what was happening with the expression, if it was an expression, of a creature updating a model. He was very still. His amber-glass eyes moved across the room, noting, cataloging, not afraid. Something more unsettling than afraid. Interested. "How?" he said, and it wasn't entirely a question. "We didn't stop talking to each other," Mira said. She was standing in the center of the room with the bell in her hand, and her father's eyes, and the borrowed high-visibility vest, which was incongruent enough to be briefly surreal. "That's all. You took down the people at the top and waited for the structure to collapse. But the people at the bottom kept talking to each other. That's what you didn't model. We don't just work vertically. We work sideways, horizontally. We gossip, and we argue, and we share things we probably shouldn't, and we give bells to people we love. And we drive strangers around in delivery vans because someone asked us to." She looked at him steadily. 60 years of watching us and you understood our hierarchies perfectly. You just didn't understand why we like each other. Garen stood in the steam-lit hall for another few seconds. Expression moved across his face once more, indecipherable. Then Jun hit him, which was very effective. The ship left from the ocean floor off the Hokkaido coast. Kale saw it through the window of the van as they drove north at dawn, a shape rising through the water several kilometers offshore. Vast and luminous, something that had been built for deep space and had been sitting at the bottom of the Pacific for 60 years wearing patience like armor. Broke the surface, and then it was ascending. And the pre-dawn sky went briefly very bright where it passed through, and then it was gone. There were no alien bodies to explain. The Keth Varun, who had been here in physical housing, had retreated with their ship. Biological housings recalled and restored when the mission parameters failed, and the threshold for extraction was crossed. There were burned relay arrays in 6 locations. There were the bodies of the local human collaborators who had been recruited in the early consolidation phase. There was a conference room in Kyoto that still had a forensic mystery that would take years to close. There was a very damaged traditional inn outside Noboribetsu with a parking lot full of disabled vehicles. There was no easily digestible explanation. There never would be. Mira sat in the passenger seat and watched the last light of the ascending ship fade. Kale drove north, because north was where they'd come from, and coming back from somewhere felt like the right direction. It'll come back, she said, something like it. Probably. They have the model now. They know what failed. Yes, Kale thought about this. But so do we, she looked at him. The bell rang, he said. The network held. The infrastructure they spent years building went down in 11 minutes because we built something they couldn't identify as infrastructure at all. A conversation in a rest stop. A man driving a maintenance van. You walking in with a toolbox. He glanced at the vest she was still wearing, which she appeared to have entirely forgotten about. Whatever comes next, we know what works. Mira was quiet for a while. Outside the van, the coastal road unrolled ahead of them in the early light, the sea coming in flat and silver on the right, and a fishing boat sat far out in the water, a dark point against the brightening horizon, motionless in the way of something that had been there every morning, and would be there again tomorrow, patient, in the specific manner of things that know they belong to the water. She reached into her pocket and held the bell out on its cord. The bronze was warm, and the silk was frayed at one end, and it was battered and old and entirely unimpressive. Hold on to this, she said, for the next time. Kale took it without looking away from the road. He held it for a moment. The warm weight of it, the familiar pressure that had sat against his chest for 7 days, and then hung it on the rearview mirror, next to the cartoon bear bobblehead which swayed slightly with the motion of the van, and regarded the road ahead with cheerful vacancy. Troops, he drove on. The sea was very large and the sky was getting lighter, and somewhere down in the deep dark water, something ancient was retreating, recalculating, taking notes on what it had not understood. That was all right. Humans had been leaving notes in the dark for a very long time, too. The bell swung gently in the rearview mirror as the van turned north, and the morning came in, off the water, and Kale Momota drove home through the cold and hummed because the fishermen had earned it. The debriefs, when they happened, were not official. There was no government body that had the correct category for what had occurred. The forensic teams in Kyoto would spend 18 more months finding ways not to publish what they found. The burned relay sites in Hokkaido, Tohoku, and the southern coast would be attributed variously to industrial accidents, unexplained electrical events, and in one case, an extremely irresponsible controlled demolition that the local municipality would be quietly compensating property owners for until 2031. None of it would be filed anywhere accessible. This was not a conspiracy exactly. It was more the collective instinct of institutions that could not hold what they'd found. The way a hand opens around something too hot to grip. 4 people who knew the full shape of it met twice more in the following year. Once in that same brutal rest stop south of Tomakomai, where the vending machine had been restocked but still contained only brand of canned coffee, and the fluorescent light had developed a second frequency to its buzz, lower than the first, creating a chord. Once at a noodle restaurant in Sapporo, that June had selected on the basis that the broth was correct, and she did not intend to apologize for having standards. At the noodle restaurant, Hiro had brought a new map. The anomalous signatures, the cellular geometry the pathologists in Kyoto had been quietly filing away, had appeared twice more since the Noborobetsu event. Once in the Philippines and once in the Norwegian fjords. Different territory, same pattern, the consolidation of existing power structures, the removal of nodes from the top. They sent a second team, Mira said. Or they always had multiple teams and we only disrupted one, Hiro said. The ship we saw go up wasn't the whole operation. It was the local cell. They sat with this over good broth and the sound of the restaurant around them, other people's conversations, the clatter of a kitchen, rain starting outside on the street. Then we need a wider network, Mira said. We barely hold together the one we have, June said. No, we have exactly the right network. We just need it to be in more places. She looked at each of them. Bell responded across 300 kilometers, Kale. He looked up from his noodles. How far has it ever reached? He thought about this. The facility records his grandmother had shown him. The accounts. Not myths. He had understood even then that they were not myths. They were field reports written in the language of the era, of the bell being used during the Edo period, during the chaos before it, during the decades, when the power brokers of Japan had been systematically dismantling each other, and something had been using that chaos the same way something was using it now. The account of a man in a fishing village who had received a signal he described as a ringing in the bones, and who had understood it and moved, and who had arrived in time. Far enough, he said. Mira nodded once. Then we teach people what to listen for. Outside, the rain came down on the Sapporo street, and the noodle restaurant held its warmth against it, full of people talking to each other about small, ordinary things. A child's school performance, a disagreement about a shared meal, something funny that had happened at work. The horizontal web of human social architecture, constant and unremarkable, and to certain kinds of intelligence that had studied humanity for 60 years, from the outside looking in, entirely invisible. The bell was on the table between them. Nobody had put it there deliberately. It had migrated out of pockets and bags the way significant objects do in the presence of the people who carry them. And now it sat in the center of the table, on its fraying silk cord, warm from Kale's pocket, doing nothing at all. The rain came down. The city talked to itself. The deep water was a long way away and getting further. Not far enough. Not yet. But the net was getting wider, and the threads were old and strong, and the world had been doing this, passing small, unremarkable objects between people who loved it, since long before anything had arrived to object.